Imagine coming home after a long day at work. The radio plays a soothing song and all you want to do is relax. But suddenly you're pulled over by the police. A routine stop, right? Until the officer's tone shifts, their questions become invasive, and before you know it, your skin color turns a simple stop into a true nightmare. Now, imagine that even being innocent, you are treated as guilty. Your words are ignored, and all that's left is the fear that a simple wrong move could cost you your life. But what happens when the officer discovers too late who you really are? Want to know how this story ends? Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. And if you've ever been through something similar, share your experience. This is a conversation we all need to have. It was just another Tuesday. For anyone else, a normal, almost dull day. But for me, it was one of those days when you feel like you've made a difference. I spent hours at the office, analyzing documents, connecting dots, and I began to see the end of a case that had seemed endless. As an FBI agent, that sense of progress was rare. Usually, the work dragged on for weeks, even months, but on that Tuesday things started to align. It was already dark by the time I left the building. The night air was cool and the city seemed to be winding down. I walked to my car, feeling the exhaustion but also a quiet satisfaction. It was strange, you know? I had managed to wrap up an important part of the case, something that might change lives, but deep down I couldn't shake a slight tension, an unease that was always there, even on the best days. Driving at night always helped me organize my thoughts. The street was calm with very few cars passing by, and I took advantage of that moment of peace. I turned on the radio softly. A gentle tune filled the car's silence. I started driving slowly, thinking about what I would do when I got home. Maybe I'd watch the series I was following, or pick up the book that had been sitting on my nightstand for weeks. Just some time for myself. As I drove, I started to feel that familiar sensation that, every now and then, haunted me when I was off duty. As an FBI agent, I wore my badge like an invisible shield, but when it was tucked away, things were different. People didn't see me as the professional I was, as someone who had studied, trained, who was part of something bigger. No, without the badge, without the suit, I was just another black man on the streets. And that, despite all my hard work, never fully left my mind. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone who hadn't experienced it. Small glances, gestures, microaggressions that, on their own, seemed insignificant, but together they added up to an uncomfortable weight. I'd gotten used to it. It's part of the everyday life of someone with my skin. No matter how far I had come in my career, there were still people who only saw the surface. But at that moment, I didn't let those thoughts get to me. It was just the end of another day, a drive home like any other. Or at least that's what I thought. That's when, in the distance, I saw the lights of a patrol car reflected in my rearview mirror. They blinked red and blue, and for a second I thought the car would pass me by, that it had nothing to do with me. But no. The lights grew stronger, closer, until I heard the familiar sound of the siren. I sighed, pulling over. It wasn't the first time this had happened. And honestly, I was already prepared for the kind of situation that was coming. It was just a traffic stop, right? Nothing major. I knew everything was in order. Paperwork, license, car registered in my name. There was no reason to worry. At least, that's what I tried to convince myself. I lowered the volume of the radio and waited. Through the mirror, I saw the silhouette of the officer approaching, his posture stiff, one hand already positioned on his belt. A typical stance, but one that sent a clear message: authority. He reached my side and, without even looking at me, lightly tapped the window. I rolled it down slowly, keeping calm. License and registration? He said in a firm, almost cold voice, still not looking me in the eye. I took a deep breath and handed over the documents. It was automatic. You stay calm, don't question. I knew the drill. I kept my hands visible, avoided any sudden movements. He took the papers and went back to the patrol car without saying anything. As I waited, I began to feel a slight discomfort. Something about that officer bothered me, but I tried not to dwell on it. Maybe it was just paranoia. After all, it was just a routine check, right? I looked out the window at the empty streets. The nighttime silence of the city now felt heavier. A few minutes passed and I started to wonder why it was taking so long. I fidgeted with the steering wheel, anxious as I waited. When he finally returned, his face was different, as if he had found something he shouldn't have. He held my documents with more force than before. This time he looked directly at me, his eyes cold as ice. A car like this? How'd you get it? He asked, a clear tone of distrust in his voice. The question hit me like a slap. It wasn't the first time someone had insinuated something like that, but coming from a cop, in that context, the feeling was different. It was as if he had already decided who I was, based solely on my appearance and the car I was driving. The discomfort that had previously been a vague feeling now became something palpable, like a knot tightening in the pit of my stomach. I kept calm. This wasn't the first time I'd faced this type of insinuation. I took a deep breath before responding. "I work for the FBI," I said clearly without raising my voice. I waited for his reaction. The officer looked at me with a mix of skepticism and disdain. It was as if the words I had just said had gone unnoticed. He glanced back at my documents and then at me, with a look of someone who was assessing what they saw, but had already formed an opinion. I knew that look. I grew up with it. "Work for the FBI?" he repeated, more as a provocation than a confirmation. I said nothing, just kept looking at him, trying to hold my composure. It was surreal being in this situation, a scene that, unfortunately, so many people had experienced, but one I still refused to accept as normal. Working on the front lines of justice, seeing how things work behind the scenes, sometimes gives you the false sense that you're immune. But there I was, being judged for the car I drove and the color of my skin, nothing more. He paused for an uncomfortably long time, as if he was deliberately prolonging the moment, testing my patience. Then, he returned my documents with a sharp movement, as if tired of pretending there was a justification for the stop. But before I could relax, he said something that made me realize this was far from over. "I'm going to need to take a look inside your car." My initial reaction was disbelief. My first instinct was to protest, to question the reason for that completely unjustified search. There was no reason for him to suspect me beyond the prejudiced assumptions that were clear from the start. However, I knew how quickly this kind of situation could escalate, and at that moment the last thing I wanted was to create a scenario where the tension increased. I took a second to breathe and tried to stay calm. "The car is in perfect condition, officer." My voice was calm, controlled, but firm. I didn't want to give him more reasons to keep provoking me, but I also wasn't going to easily give in to that humiliation. He looked at me again, now with a challenging gaze, as if he wanted to see how far I was willing to go. There was an arrogance there, a stance of someone who was used to having the final word, controlling the narrative. When he finally spoke, his words were loaded with the weight of his authority. "If there's nothing to hide, then I don't see a problem." The classic tactic of, "If you've done nothing wrong, why does it matter?" Classic. A tool used to justify invasion of privacy, the imposition of power. He knew what he was doing. And I knew that, no matter how much the urge to protest grew within me, this could quickly turn into something much worse if I didn't handle it carefully. But even knowing this, each second of that stop seemed to wear down my patience. The feeling of helplessness tightened in my chest. I was a federal agent, someone who should be above this kind of treatment, someone who knew the laws better than he did. But there, on that dark corner, without my badge on display, I was just another driver being treated as a suspect for reasons far from fair. "Go ahead," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral, though inside I felt the indignation growing. He leaned in to peer inside the car through the window, making a superficial inspection. His eyes moved quickly over the seats, the dashboard, as if he was searching for something that might justify the stop. I watched every move carefully, trying to keep my body relaxed, but inside I felt the stress building up like a coil being compressed. And then something changed. The officer, who until then had kept a cold and calculated stance, began subtly adjusting his right shoulder. I'd seen this before, that small gesture of adjusting one's position. My professional instincts were screaming that something was off. He was getting restless, and that put me on alert. "I'm going to need you to step out of the car," he said, stepping back, now further from the window. My mind started racing with the implications of that request. Step out of the car? For what? There was no plausible reason. This stop was already out of the ordinary. There were no grounded suspicions, and I knew that. But again, I also knew that refusing could make things worse. I looked at him, observing his tense face, his hands positioned near the belt where the gun was. It was a dangerous scenario, and he knew it. "What's the reason?" I asked, not in a challenging tone, but as someone who wanted to understand why this was happening. I still wanted to believe that there was some rationality behind this stop, as absurd as it was. The officer gave a slight smile, a smile that felt more like mockery. "Protocol. I need to ensure there's nothing wrong." I knew there was no justification for it. He was stretching the situation for reasons far from objective. And I also knew that questioning him more deeply could put me in an even more vulnerable position. The problem with situations like this is that, no matter how well you know your rights, the power on the other side of the coin always weighs more. Especially when the other side has a gun. I did as he asked, trying to keep my movements slow and controlled, stepping out of the car with my hands visible. He looked at me as if waiting for me to make a mistake, any slip, any movement that could justify a more aggressive action. I felt the weight of that gaze with every step I took, and the air between us was thick with unspoken tension. When I stepped away from the car, he started circling it, his eyes scanning the exterior as if searching for something obvious, something that simply wasn't there. I knew this was more theater than anything else. He was prolonging a situation that had made no sense from the beginning. Each second seemed to drag on, the silence between us only broken by the distant sounds of the city that continued to move while I was trapped on that corner, waiting for it all to be over. By this point, my patience was wearing thin. Every fiber of my being told me to end this situation, but at the same time, caution was necessary. Any mistake on my part could have consequences I wasn't willing to face. Finally, he looked back at me. "Looks like everything's in order here." Those words, said so casually, almost like a generous concession, made my blood boil. Looks like. Of course everything was in order. I'd known that from the start. But the issue wasn't the car, the paperwork, or any other physical thing. The issue was me. When the officer finally gave that casual declaration that everything seemed to be in order, I felt a mix of relief and anger. I had known from the beginning that there was nothing wrong with the car, with me, with the situation itself. However, that small piece of theater, the power play he'd staged, wasn't about what was right or wrong. It was about making me feel small, vulnerable, as if I had to prove something he'd known all along. As he handed back my documents and I put them back in my pocket, my mind was still trying to process what had just happened. The discomfort didn't come from the stop itself, but from the way it had unfolded. It was as if there was something more, something I couldn't quite define, but that hung in the air, dense and heavy with tension. And with that came a feeling. I'd been in many tense situations throughout my career, and this sixth sense, this ability to feel the atmosphere changing, was something I'd developed over the years. It was as if my body knew before my mind could process it, that something was off. And at that moment, although the stop was technically over, the unease inside me only grew. I tried to ignore it, to get back in the car, close the door, and be on my way. But there was something about that officer's face, an expression I hadn't caught until that moment. When he handed me back my documents and stepped back, his expression of arrogance dissolved, giving way to something that worried me even more: disdain. It was as if he knew he had exercised power over me and that now, I was at the mercy of his judgment, but not in the sense of justice. Even so, I kept my composure. I got into the car carefully, closed the door slowly, and placed my hands on the steering wheel for a moment, trying to collect myself before starting the engine. The atmosphere inside the car was heavy, and my mind was conflicted. Part of me wanted to forget what had just happened and move on with the night, but another part, a much more restless part, knew this wasn't the end. The foreboding was stronger now. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and to my discomfort, I saw that the officer was still there, standing beside his patrol car, watching me. He hadn't left, hadn't returned to whatever he was doing before pulling me over. No, he was there, unmoving, his eyes fixed on me as if he were waiting for something. What was he waiting for? That thought struck me like a spark of panic. I decided that enough was enough. I started the car, feeling the engine hum softly, and began to prepare to drive away. That's when the siren blared again. The piercing noise cut through the silence of the street like a knife, and my body immediately froze. That alertness I'd felt, lurking in the back of my mind, now manifested fully. What was happening? I looked in the rearview mirror again, and the officer was approaching the car once more, but this time, there was something different in his stance. He wasn't just walking up to me. He had his hand on his belt, as if he'd made the decision to escalate the situation. My heart began to race. I'd seen this before. This wasn't just a routine stop he was dragging out for no reason. He was prepared to act more aggressively. I took a deep breath, trying to control the fear that was starting to tighten in my chest. I knew there were two ways to deal with this: confront the situation or stay calm and avoid any escalation. I chose the second option because, at that moment, the last thing I needed was to provoke a reaction he was clearly waiting for. But the discomfort was almost suffocating. "Step out of the car again," he ordered, knocking on the window harder than necessary. This time, there wasn't even a please or any attempt at keeping up appearances. It was an order. I opened the door slowly, once again trying to stay calm. But the discomfort only grew. Now he was only a few feet away from me, his hand still on his belt, and the hostility on his face was clear as day. This wasn't just a traffic stop anymore. There was something more, something he had decided in that instant. "Raise your hands," he demanded, and that was when my mind froze. Raise my hands? What? What had I done to justify that? I knew that protocol required officers to act with caution. But there was absolutely nothing to justify this escalation. In that instant, the air around me seemed to transform into an invisible battlefield, and every move I made seemed to be scrutinized under a microscope. I was being dehumanized. I raised my hands slowly, feeling the weight of injustice fall upon me. My hands were now visible, but my mind was racing. What was happening? What did he really want? I knew that, at that moment, it wasn't about a traffic stop. It was about control. He wanted to put me in a position of submission, and the situation had completely spiraled out of control. The silence between us was palpable, interrupted only by the occasional sound of a car passing by in the distance. My heart beat to the rhythm of uncertainty, but I tried to keep my gaze steady, staring back at him. I knew he was used to exercising this type of power, to intimidating people like me. And I also knew that, no matter how indignant I was, it was crucial to stay calm. One wrong move could trigger something irreversible. "What's the problem now?" I asked, my voice controlled but loaded with indignation I could barely contain. He didn't respond immediately. His eyes narrowed and he took a step toward me, closer than before. His silence, the way he looked at me, told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't there to protect, wasn't there to ensure safety. He was there to humiliate me, to exercise complete control over me, over my body, my life in that moment. I could feel the weight of each second passing. There was no easy way out. The feeling that this was turning into something far bigger than a simple traffic stop was being confirmed. And at that moment, I realized I was about to face a situation that could change everything. I raised my hands as the officer ordered, every muscle in my body tense as if expecting the worst at any moment. The feeling of being under a microscope was suffocating. Me, a federal agent, being treated like a criminal, waiting to be searched, publicly humiliated, there on the sidewalk of some random street. I felt heat rising in my face, a mixture of shame and revolt building inside me. But at the same time, I knew I couldn't show it. I had to stay in control. "Can you explain the reason for this stop now?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady but without sounding defiant. I already knew the answer. Or at least I thought I did. He completely ignored me. There wasn't even the effort to pretend that this was a standard procedure. His silence was deafening, almost as if he wanted to show me that, at that moment, my words carried no weight at all. It was a power game. I knew this type of dynamic well. The problem was that now I was on the other side of the coin. He started walking around me, circling slowly, looking me up and down as if he were waiting for me, somehow, to make a mistake, to incriminate myself. I felt sweat trickling down the back of my neck, my heart beating harder with each step he took. Every time he came closer, my body instinctively prepared for a confrontation I didn't want to happen. "Is there anything in the car I should know about?" he asked, his voice filled with disdain. "I already told you there isn't," I replied, struggling to keep my tone calm. He stopped in front of me and placed his hands on his hips in a stance that seemed to prepare for something. His look was cold, distant, and he was clearly interested in prolonging the humiliation for as long as possible. "If there's nothing, why are you so nervous?" he asked, this time with a smirk, a clear provocation. I felt my stomach twist in frustration. It wasn't nervousness, it was indignation. But how could I explain that to him, someone who had already decided who I was and what I represented? "I'm answering all your questions and cooperating." I knew arguing with him was pointless, but I couldn't help it. I needed to reaffirm that this situation didn't make sense. "If there's anything else you need to check, you can do it now. I've already told you everything you need to know." He let out a short, dry laugh, as if amused by the fact that I was trying to maintain some dignity. He knew he had control and was stretching that rope as far as it would go. "I'm the one who decides that," he said, stepping close enough that I could smell the strong mix of coffee and cigarettes on his breath. "And if you don't like the way things are, that's not my fault." There was something very dangerous in that statement. It was loaded with a veiled threat, with an implicit power that he knew he could wield without a second thought. And as he continued to stare at me with that disdainful look, something inside me started to revolt. Why was he dragging this out? What was his intention? "This has gone too far," I finally let slip. It wasn't exactly what I meant to say. It sounded more like an outburst than a direct confrontation. "Too far?" he repeated, raising an eyebrow as if genuinely confused, or pretending to be. "I don't think you have any idea what too far can be." This time he went over to the trunk of the car, dragging his feet as if he were looking for something to justify dragging out this stop. My hands were still raised and I was trying to remain as calm as possible, though the anger inside me was close to overflowing. The humiliation wasn't just about being searched. It was his gaze, the way he disregarded me as a human being, as someone worthy of respect. The worst part was knowing that, even in a position of authority, my word here was worth less than nothing. I was a federal agent, a man who had dedicated years to serving this country, but to this officer, in that moment, I was nothing more than another nameless suspect. As he inspected the trunk, I noticed something. Cars passing slowly along the street, people in the back seats looking on with curiosity. Some trying to understand what was going on, others simply assuming the worst. That was the power of his uniform. He didn't need any reason other than the fact that I was there at the wrong time with the wrong skin color, driving the wrong car. Suddenly, the officer slammed the trunk shut with a loud snap, as if closing a chapter in a sadistic game. He looked at me again, but now there was something different in his eyes. "Why are you in a car like this?" His question came almost casually, but the tone behind the words was loaded with judgment. "A car like this?" I repeated, genuinely confused for a moment. Then I understood. He was talking about the car itself, a luxury sedan. Exactly. He crossed his arms, as if waiting for me to give him an answer that would confirm his suspicions. "This isn't the kind of car you'd expect someone like you to be driving, is it?" The words dripped like poison. "Someone like you. That's what this was about all along." It wasn't about the car, it wasn't about paperwork or a routine traffic stop. It was about me. Who I was, how I looked, and where, in his mind, I should or shouldn't be. I knew I was trapped. Not physically but mentally, emotionally. If I tried to confront him directly, he would have the power to turn the situation against me. But if I kept going along with this forced cooperation, I'd just prolong the humiliation. I was caught in a snare. "You're out of line, officer," I responded, my voice tense but still under control. "You have no right to make assumptions about who I am or where I should be." He stared at me as if considering what I'd said for a brief moment. But then he smiled. A cruel smile, one that said that nothing I said would make a difference. "We'll see who's out of line here," he muttered as he started walking toward the squad car, never taking his eyes off me. My instincts told me that the worst was yet to come. Something about his posture, the way he was deliberately prolonging the stop, left a knot in my stomach. The feeling of helplessness, mixed with the embarrassment of being exposed in this way, was overwhelming. And I knew deep down that this power game was far from over. Things had already escalated beyond a simple traffic stop. The officer walked slowly to his patrol car, with that look that seemed to carry all the authority in the world. I watched him closely, trying to anticipate his next move. Each step he took seemed calculated, as if he were savoring every second of the situation. And I knew that, the way things were going, I was about to reach my breaking point. As he returned to the car, I had a brief moment of reflection. I knew I had something in my hands that could change the entire dynamic of this stop. My identity as an FBI agent was what kept me calm up until now, even though the pride within me was ready to react at any moment. I could end this. All I needed was one sentence. But the question was, should I really reveal who I was? In a way, I felt conflicted. Part of me didn't want to give him the power to think that only because of my professional status did I deserve respect. It was almost as if, by saying I was with the FBI, I would be confirming that he had the right to treat me this way until he knew who I was. On the other hand, another part of me just wanted this to end soon, and I knew that this revelation would be enough to change the course of events. I had a difficult decision to make. Before I could think more about it, the officer returned. He approached slowly with a clipboard in hand and that same disdainful look he'd been wearing from the start. When he stopped in front of me, he made no attempt to hide the arrogant tone he'd been using all along. "All right," he said theatrically, as if he were about to pass down a sentence. "I need you to come with me to the station for a more thorough check. Are you willing to cooperate?" I stared at him for a few seconds, processing what he had just said. Go to the station? This was completely out of proportion. He had already checked my documents, searched the car, asked all possible questions. And yet, here we were, in the middle of a nightmare scenario. "This is unnecessary," I responded, feeling my patience quickly wearing thin. "You've already done all the necessary checks. There's no reason for you to take me to the station." He let out a dry chuckle, as if he found it amusing that I was still trying to reason with him. To him, it was clear, I was just another black man behind the wheel of an expensive car, someone who needed to be controlled and subdued regardless of anything else. His power play had gone too far and I was tired of playing by his rules. That's when I decided I couldn't keep my identity a secret any longer. The embarrassment, the humiliation, the thinly veiled abuse. All of it made me realize that, as much as I wanted to fight this battle without having to use my status, my safety and dignity were on the line. I took a deep breath, trying to control the anger building up inside, and looked directly into his eyes. "You might want to reconsider this," I began, my voice firm but still calm. "Because I'm an FBI agent." The silence that followed was almost deafening. I could see the shock flash briefly in his eyes, a small crack in the facade of arrogance he'd kept up the whole time. For a second, he hesitated, as if processing the information and trying to figure out if I was telling the truth. "Oh, really?" he replied, trying to keep his composure, but now with a note of uncertainty in his voice. "Can you prove that?" I was prepared for that question. I stayed calm, opening my wallet and slowly taking out my badge. I handed it to him, watching his reaction closely. For a brief moment, the contempt vanished completely from his face, replaced by an expression of surprise and, perhaps, a flicker of fear. He looked at the badge, then back at me, as if trying to understand how the situation had shifted so quickly. That unwavering confidence he'd displayed since the beginning seemed shaken, and it was clear he wasn't ready for this revelation. "Seems like this went too far, don't you think?" I said, crossing my arms, no longer trying to hide my indignation. The officer blinked a few times as if processing everything. He looked at the badge again, and I could see the hesitation growing in him. Now he was at a point where he had to decide how to proceed. And for the first time that night, he was the one who looked uncomfortable. He began, clearly thrown off balance. "I couldn't have known, sir. That wasn't clear from the start." His words were loaded with an excuse he was desperate to justify. It was obvious he was trying to smooth over the situation, as if the revelation of my identity had somehow turned everything he'd done into a simple misunderstanding. But there was no misunderstanding. He knew exactly what he was doing from the start, and now he was trying to escape the trap he had set for himself. "It's not about who I am," I interrupted, my voice firmer now. "It's about how you treated me without even knowing. And the only reason for that was because I didn't look like someone, in your view, who should be driving this car." He stayed silent. And for the first time I saw him at a loss for words. The arrogance he had so openly displayed had disappeared, and now he was caught in the web of his own choices. The revelation of my identity as an FBI agent had completely shifted the dynamics, but the truth was that the damage was already done. It no longer mattered who I was. What he'd done before that revelation said far more than any badge. His discomfort was visible, but at the same time, I felt a bitter sense of relief growing inside me. I had finally exposed the truth he had been trying to hide under layers of power abuse and racism disguised as procedure. Now he knew he had lost control of the situation, and I had regained mine. He handed my badge back to me with a brief, nervous nod. "Can we consider this over then?" he asked, his voice now almost pleading for my agreement. I looked at him for a long moment, weighing my options. As much as the temptation to expose his abuse was great, I knew that confrontation had reached its end. "That depends on you," I replied. "Depends on how you're going to act from here on out." He nodded, still uncomfortable. He knew that from that moment, every decision he made would be measured, and the consequences could finally fall on him. The situation wasn't resolved, but at that moment, I had turned the tables. The relief I felt after revealing my identity as an FBI agent was short-lived. Something inside me was still on high alert. The officer had backed off, of course, but not entirely. There was visible discomfort in his posture, but also something else. A subtle resistance, as if he still hadn't decided to fully yield. He knew he wasn't in a position to continue playing that game, but his arrogance wouldn't let him simply walk away. I was putting my badge back in my wallet when I saw him approaching again, this time with stiff shoulders and a colder gaze than before. The silence between us was thick, heavy, and the air around us felt electrified. Something was shifting in the atmosphere, something that made me stay alert to his every move. It was almost as if he were weighing his options, and I knew that for him, fully backing down would be a personal humiliation. "I see that you're a federal agent, but," he hesitated for a second, trying to measure his words, "that doesn't change the fact that you were stopped for suspicious behavior." His tone was cautious, but there was a challenging note behind it. He was still trying to maintain a sliver of control over the situation. I knew that, for someone like him, conceding would mean admitting he had made a mistake. And deep down, that's what unsettled me the most. There was something in his gaze that indicated he wasn't ready to let it go. "Suspicious behavior?" I asked, exhaustion and irritation beginning to seep through. "You stopped me because, in your mind, I shouldn't be driving this car, right? Now that you know who I am, what's your justification for keeping this going?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes held mine, evaluating, as if he were trying to find a way out that wouldn't leave him vulnerable. It was obvious he was searching for a way to maintain the appearance of authority, even knowing he had crossed all boundaries. "I'm not questioning your profession," he finally said. "But lately, we've had a lot of cases of identity falsification and abuse of power by people using fake badges. I just need to make sure everything's in order." That caught me off guard. He had just subtly insinuated that he might be accusing me of faking my identity. It was a dangerous move. Not only because it was an unfounded accusation, but because he knew he was pushing me into a new situation where I'd have to defend myself once again. "Are you accusing me of falsifying my badge?" The coldness in my voice was evident, but I forced myself to stay in control. He shrugged, feigning indifference, but the glint in his eyes betrayed his intent. He wanted to see how far I was willing to go. It was almost as if he realized he had lost a battle but was still trying to find a way to save his pride. "I'm not accusing anything," he said with a half-smile that seemed more like a taunt. "Just want to ensure everything's fine. A standard procedure, you know how it is." I knew exactly what he was doing. He was playing on doubt, trying to prolong the humiliation in a disguised way, as if the power he exerted over me was something legitimate and necessary. He'd lost initial control over the situation, but now, with this insinuation, he was trying to turn the game around again without making it obvious that it was retaliation for me revealing my true identity. The worst part was that technically, he was within the limits of what could be considered procedure, at least superficially. I knew the rules well, knew how identity verification protocols worked, but I also knew he was twisting those rules to extend my discomfort and reassert his power. It was an implicit threat, wrapped in a false concern for legality. A wave of frustration washed over me. The anger I had been holding back up to that point was about to erupt, but I knew I needed to keep a cool head. However, the embarrassment of being in that position again, even after revealing my identity, was unbearable. "All right," I said slowly, my words laden with forced calm. "Then let's do this the right way. I'll call my supervisor and he can come here and clarify any doubts you have about my badge's authenticity." I knew this was a risky move, but it was also a way to show that I was willing to take this situation as far as necessary. If he wanted to question my identity, he'd have to deal with a higher authority, and deep down, I knew that would intimidate him. I was putting my cards on the table, making it clear that if he insisted, things could take a much more serious turn. He hesitated for a second, and I could see the discomfort growing in him. He hadn't expected me to escalate the situation this way. It was clear he didn't want to involve anyone else. The control he sought was personal, immediate, and now he realized he was about to completely lose that control if he continued. "There's no need for that," he finally said, trying to sound casual, but the tension in his voice was obvious. "We just need to make sure we're doing our job correctly." But I had him cornered. The power game he'd been trying to maintain was unraveling, and he knew it. The threat he was attempting to imply was losing its strength, and now he was running out of options. The silence between us was heavy, laden with a mutual understanding that this confrontation was about to end, one way or another. "Let's resolve this now," I said firmly, already reaching for my phone in my pocket. He took a step back, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. "No need for that, Agent. Let's call it here." It seems there was a misunderstanding, and in that moment I knew he had finally given up. The atmosphere shifted immediately, the implicit threat he carried evaporating into the air. I had broken the cycle he was trying to perpetuate, and now he knew he no longer had room to continue with that attitude. But the taste of victory was bitter. There was no glory in knowing he only backed off because the pressure forced him to. The damage was already done. He tried one last gesture of control, muttering something about standard procedures as he walked away, but the harm was visible, out in the open. And even as he returned to his patrol car, I knew the threat wasn't just about that moment. It was something bigger, deeper. A reminder that, for many like him, my worth would only be recognized when my badge was in sight. I watched him walk away, his back stiff, trying to maintain his composure as he headed to the patrol car. The engine rumbled low, and he stayed there for a few seconds as if he were waiting for something. Maybe he expected me to back down or show some weakness, but I remained steady, arms crossed, gaze fixed on him. The confrontation was over, at least for now, but the sense of danger hadn't disappeared. There was something in that approach that still made me feel on edge. It was as if the silence he left behind was loaded with an implicit threat, something he couldn't say outright but still hovered over us. The patrol car's lights flashed one last time, and he finally accelerated, disappearing into the distance along the avenue. The sound of the car fading away brought a strange feeling of relief mixed with a bitter taste. I had managed to get out of that situation without further consequences, but the emotional damage was already done. It didn't matter that I was an FBI agent or anything else. In that moment I was just another black man, stopped for looking suspicious, simply for existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. As the hours of the night moved on, I stood there for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. The feeling of relief was superficial, like a wound that had closed but was still tender to the touch. The anger, the frustration, the helplessness, they were still pulsing within me like a flame that wouldn't go out. I knew that if I hadn't revealed my identity, the situation could have turned out very differently. Maybe I'd be in handcuffs right now, maybe worse. The thought disgusted me, but it also made me reflect on how much we rely on something as superficial as a title or position of power to guarantee our dignity. I sat in the car, the cold steering wheel between my hands, and looked at the dashboard, still trying to absorb the sequence of events. What bothered me most wasn't just the approach itself, but the fact that this wasn't an isolated event. It was part of something much larger, something that all of us who don't fit the mold of privilege they consider normal, face day after day. The humiliation isn't always explicit. Sometimes it comes in looks of suspicion, in questions disguised as cordiality, in excessive demands that would never be made of someone else. And worst of all, it comes in situations where we're at the mercy of an authority that doesn't see us as equals. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. I knew that, in a way, I had managed to turn the tables, but the victory was hollow. Because it wasn't really a victory. The fact that I had to use my professional status to be treated with a minimum of respect was, in itself, a defeat. And that was a truth I couldn't ignore. The reality is that, for many like me, the badge is the shield, but also the proof that without it, we are vulnerable. I remembered the look in the officer's eyes before he left. There was a gleam of frustration in them, something that made it clear that even after my revelation, he didn't see me as someone worthy of respect. I had forced him to back down, yes, but he still believed he had the right to treat me that way. In his mind, I still wasn't good enough to be driving that car, to be on that street, to be anything other than what his racist assumptions determined. I picked up my phone and looked at it, thinking about calling my supervisor to report the incident. It was the right thing to do after all. But I hesitated. Part of me knew that even if the report was filed, the consequences for that officer would likely be minimal. And what would that change anyway? A man like him would continue acting the same way, only he'd be more careful next time. It was the system that allowed him to exist that way, that empowered him to use his authority abusively. But then, thinking about that, I felt a wave of determination growing within me. It wasn't just about that officer. It was about all the others who did the same thing day after day, under the guise of procedure or security. And what would I do with that? Let it go, as so many other times, or use this experience as a wake-up call? I knew I had to do something. Perhaps formally report it. Perhaps share the story so that others could see what really happens in the subtext of these encounters. My mind was made up. I couldn't just leave this behind. Maybe I'd escaped without serious consequences, but it wasn't about me. It was about how many others would still face the same cycle of humiliation, abuse, and prejudice, without a badge to guarantee them a way out. I needed to expose this. I opened my messaging app and began writing to my supervisor, explaining what had happened. My hands were steady now, indignation guiding each word I typed. I knew that officer wouldn't be the last to try to subjugate me based on racial assumptions, but I also knew that if I didn't take action, I'd be allowing him to go on, unpunished, reinforcing his power over others who couldn't defend themselves. When I finished writing the message, I leaned back in the seat and closed my eyes for a moment. I had done what I could. Now the ball was in their court. But I wouldn't stop there. I knew this story needed to be told, not for me but for everyone who, every day, is silenced and marginalized without a badge to give them a voice. The night was silent around me, but within, a storm was starting to build. When I sent the message to my supervisor, I felt a slight rush of adrenaline, as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. I knew that reporting the incident was just the beginning of a larger struggle. Now the system would have to respond. And even though I knew the wheels of justice could be slow and unequal, the simple act of reporting was already a form of resistance. As I looked out the window, the headlights of cars passed slowly, illuminating the darkness of the street. The city seemed to breathe around me, but inside my car, the silence wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. There was no music, no voices. Just the echo of the past minutes, repeating in my mind like a scratched record. The officer's words still reverberated. Suspicious behavior. It was funny how such a simple term could carry so much venom. He knew he was wrong, that he had no grounds for that stop, but he used the mantle of security to mask his racism. How many times had I heard terms like that? In work meetings, in airports, in upscale stores. Prejudice dressed up as concern, as protocol. I'd been trapped in this cycle forever, and that night just made it even clearer. Being stopped on the street, questioned, treated as suspicious because of the color of my skin wasn't new to me. And still, every time it happened, the feeling was as if it were the first. The indignation, the embarrassment, the anger. They were always there, latent, ready to consume me. I took my badge out of my pocket and examined it under the faint light coming through the car window. A symbol of authority, power, respect. But, at the same time, an armor I was forced to wear to be seen as human. It was ironic. I had become an FBI agent to fight injustices, to protect those who couldn't defend themselves. And yet, here I was, needing to use that same badge to protect myself from a system that was supposed to work for everyone. My mind returned to the moment of the stop. The officer's look, the way he was reluctant to acknowledge he was wrong, how he didn't want to let me go without making me feel inferior. It was more than a casual encounter. It was part of a structure, a mentality that had taken root so deeply that even faced with a badge, even with clear evidence of who I was, he still sought ways to dehumanize me. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the relentless stream of thoughts. I knew that dwelling on the situation wouldn't help, but it was hard to shake the frustration. Why were we still fighting this? Why, in the 21st century, did people like me still have to prove our worth every step of the way? I decided I needed to talk to someone. I couldn't let this experience just echo in my mind. I needed to verbalize, to get it out. I grabbed my phone and, without a second thought, called Malik. He was a longtime friend, someone who had been through similar situations and always had a word of support, even when the world seemed unfair and cruel. The phone rang a few times before he answered. His familiar voice brought an immediate sense of comfort. Hey brother. All good? Malik always started with that question even when he knew something was wrong. It was his way of giving me space to talk or not talk depending on how I felt. Not really, I replied, letting out a sigh. I just went through something ridiculous. Got stopped by a cop, again? There was a brief silence on the other end. I knew Malik was processing the words, trying to understand the gravity of the situation before responding. What happened? Did he disrespect you? His voice was more serious now, firmer. Yes, pretty much. First, he came up with that suspicious behavior line. Then, even after I showed my badge, he kept trying to intimidate me, suggesting I was faking my identity. Malik made a frustrated sound, almost a growl. Man, that's unacceptable. But you know they always try. The badge, the ID. None of it really matters to them when they see our skin. They only see what they want to see. He was right, of course. It's always been like that. And what irritated me the most was the helplessness that came with that realization. I know. But man, this has to stop. I'm tired of justifying myself, of defending myself. I did what I had to do. I sent a report to my supervisor. But it's bigger than that. How do we still have to deal with this kind of thing? Malik sighed on the other end. We deal because we have no choice. But at the same time, we have to keep calling it out. We have to speak up. We can't let it slide because if we go silent, they win. Those words echoed in my head for a while. If we go silent, they win. Malik was right. This fight wasn't just mine. It wasn't just about that moment. It was about all of us who go through this daily, and now more than ever, it was my responsibility to use my voice to bring attention to the problem. I know, brother. And I'll keep fighting, I replied, my voice now firmer. But it's exhausting. You know how it is. I do. And I'm with you. Always. Let me know if you need anything. If you want to talk more about it, I'm here. But don't let it consume you, okay? I thanked Malik for the support and hung up. Even after the conversation, I knew the emotions were still raw, but there was a clarity in me now. No matter how exhausting the fight, I couldn't give up. I couldn't let this kind of situation become normal, acceptable. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to calm myself. I knew this wouldn't be the last confrontation I would face. The world wouldn't change overnight. But at least for today, I had done my part. I sat in the car for a few minutes, reflecting on the conversation with Malik. He always had a way of calming me, of bringing things into a broader perspective. But although his words gave me strength, the discomfort remained, like a persistent hum in the back of my mind. The phone pinged with a new message, an automated response from my supervisor confirming receipt of my report. I knew he would only read it in the morning, but just taking action already gave me a slight sense of relief. Even if the system was slow, bureaucratic, and not always just, I had to believe that, this time it would be different. Not for me, but for those who would come after me, those who wouldn't have the same chance to defend themselves. I drove back home in silence, the empty streets passing as blurs around me. The world outside went on with its indifferent routine, while my insides were still churning. When I finally parked in front of my building, I felt the exhaustion set in. I climbed the steps slowly, entered my apartment, and without changing, collapsed on the couch. The night, which had started as just another day, now felt like it had lasted an eternity. I closed my eyes but couldn't relax. My mind was still racing, replaying every detail of that encounter with the cop, every word spoken, every gesture exchanged. What bothered me the most, though, was the feeling that, even though I had escaped physically unscathed, the weight of that interaction was still with me, a constant reminder that, no matter how hard I tried, I would never be seen as just an ordinary man. The next morning came too quickly. Sunlight seeped through the curtains, filling the room with soft hues. I got up from the couch, my body sore, but I knew the day wouldn't wait for me. I had to face whatever came next. I arrived at the office early as usual. The FBI building always gave me a mix of pride and discomfort. On the one hand, it represented everything I had achieved. On the other, it also symbolized the invisible barriers that sometimes seemed insurmountable. Today, that discomfort felt stronger than usual. I passed the security, exchanging quick nods, and headed to my office. Before I even sat down, the phone rang. It was my supervisor. "Can you come to my office? We need to discuss your report." It was expected, but the formality in his voice made me tense. I knew he couldn't ignore what had happened, but I also didn't know exactly what the institutional response would be. When I entered, he was seated behind the desk, his eyes fixed on me as I settled into the chair in front of him. "I read what you sent," he began without preamble. "This is serious. I'm going to forward it to Internal Affairs, but we need to be prepared for the fact that, even with the badge, you might face resistance." I knew exactly what he meant. The system was far from perfect, and in many situations, protecting its own members, like the officer who stopped me, was more common than ensuring justice. But hearing it out loud stirred something inside me. "So that's it?" I asked, my voice firmer than I expected. "We report it and they just ignore it because it's more convenient?" He sighed, leaning forward, clasping his hands on the desk. "It's not that, but you need to understand what we're up against. Racism within law enforcement isn't a small issue. It's a systemic problem, and while we can try to address it case by case, change doesn't happen overnight." My frustration was palpable. I knew he was right, but I couldn't accept the idea that this would just be another case, another file gathering dust in the system. "Not for me. I'm going to submit the report and give you the support you need. I'm just saying it may not be enough," he continued in a tone almost paternal. I left his office with a heavier weight on my shoulders. His words made me think, how many times had I myself turned a blind eye to situations like this just to keep things moving? How many other agents, just like me, had gone through something similar and kept quiet because they knew the system wouldn't protect them? In the weeks that followed, I waited for a response from Internal Affairs, but all I received were notifications that the case was under review. With each empty update, the frustration only grew. Malik would message me now and then asking how things were going, and though I appreciated the support, I knew he too was tired of waiting for answers that never came. But then one day an answer finally came. I received a short, direct email: "Case closed. Insufficient evidence to proceed." Those words blinked on the screen, each letter a blow. Close. Everything I had reported, every detail of the stop, all of it deemed insufficient. I knew this could happen. My supervisor had warned me, Malik too. But knowing didn't make the reality any less harsh. The badge, the position, the evidence. I was just another number in the system. I closed the laptop with force and looked out the office window. The day outside went on as usual, indifferent to my inner turmoil. Injustice seemed as common as sunrise. But instead of giving in to frustration, I felt something different growing inside me. Yes, the system had failed me as it had failed so many others. But I still had a powerful weapon: my voice. I wouldn't let this story die there in a closed report. I picked up my phone and sent a quick message to Malik. "I think it's time to take this story to the public." He replied in seconds, "I'm with you, brother. Let's do this."